Okay. And with that, we've got 67 or 68 participants here. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off, and then Kia, I'm going to give it to you, and I'll keep letting people in, but I think you should just get rolling. Once again, Kathy Alger, Executive Director, Crew DC, thank you for being here. We are about to embark on a discussion, a very frank discussion led by our Raise Up Your Voice Award winner, Kia Weatherspoon, who's just awesome in every way. And she's going to lead us through a conversation I think that so many of us have been wanting to have. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to Kia.
Great afternoon. My name is Kia Weatherspoon, and I am a person who has seen a therapist regularly for the past 2 years. I start with that so we can jump right into our first question. There is a social stigma associated with mental health. The social stigma associated with mental health can be a deterrent in speaking up and seeking help. What are some ways we can reduce the stigma around mental health? And I want to open that up to all of our panelists. And I'm going to start with Lynette.
Yeah, so thank you, Kia. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I would say that reducing social stigma around mental health starts with doing things like this, what we're doing right now, which is having spaces where we can have open dialogue. And if we're going to take it a step further, especially within a corporate, and Nancy could probably speak more to this, it's also really kind of starting from the leadership down and having your corporate environment create opportunities for mental health to be destigmatized through their policies, through the benefits that they offer, such as having EAP programs. One of the things that I would say that has been quite helpful and useful to me that can apply both personally and professionally to decrease stigma is to actually encourage training. And I'm not sure if everyone already got the resources that was sent out, but one of the resources that was mentioned was mental health first aid. And that's a training program basically to be more aware of what does mental health look like? What does mental health challenges look like? And how do they present themselves so that we can be aware of it and respond compassionately and non-judgmentally? I mean, one of the factors that's constantly discussed when doing mental health training is they have like this mnemonic device called algae, and it's basically assess, listen, give information, like resources, and then encourage. So there's 2 E's. So having basic training like that is really, really helpful. And those are things that you can take individually. I took it individually. I just went on Eventbrite and was like mental health first aid and like just to see where I could get the training for free. But companies offer those trainings. So just having that training, having somebody come to your workplace to offer these workshops of mental health training could help reduce the stigma, because now we're normalizing talking about specifically mental health. A lot of the times, workplace wellness will veer towards the physical side. But if we specifically have trainings around mental health, that's going to significantly reduce stigma surrounding mental health.
Fantastic. Nancy, I want to piggyback on what Lynette said here. And why do you think this stigma has existed? And why are we just now acknowledging it? And what can we do to reduce it?
Oh, Kia, first of all, thank you again for hosting this and having us. And the fact that we're having this conversation, as Lynn said, this is the place to start. This is how we destigmatize it. When I think it's because everyone is afraid they're going to be labeled as crazy. I mean, we all know that that's a term that everybody has heard and has used incessantly. It's used in the media. It's often used for women that are going through changes, hormonal changes in their life. People are afraid of being seen as crazy, weird, different, whatever. That's part of why there's a stigma. The other part is because everybody has been told to be strong, to never show their vulnerability. That's beginning to change, but for many companies, that's still scary for folks to be able to walk in and bring their whole selves to the workplace. That's just never been something that's been accepted, because I think traditionally there's been this patriarchal model of leadership that, frankly, doesn't work that well. And so if we are going to address stigma and get beyond it, we have to start having honest, real conversations and realize that what goes on up here in the head is connected to the rest of our body. If somebody had a physical illness, it's probably okay to talk about it at work. So we definitely believe in destigmatizing and creating less fear around a concept that's just so normal, which is our own mental health and well-being.
I love that. Thank you, Nate. I love this, removing the fear from it. Shaylee, I'm going to have you jump in here and talk about how can we remove the stigma around mental health.
Hello, everybody. And before I jump in, I want to apologize for my very feisty cat who loves the webcam. So pardon me as I try to get her off my back and off my table and in front of the webcam. If you would indulge me, I'd like to actually come at it more from a personal point of view and share my own personal story. I am a healthcare technology executive, been about 25 plus years in healthcare industry overseeing technology. And you would think that in a field like healthcare, which deals with wellness, it should be probably the most safest area. Yet I'm here to tell you, in my own journey, I struggled with depression since probably I was 3 years old, though I did not know that term. And it was really never even diagnosed till about 3 years ago. And the only thing I knew is this weird feeling of low or mood swings that I go through is just how we teenagers are just a little crazy. And the way to cope with it is you muscle your way through it, you become stronger. You don't let it bring yourself down. So when you're low, you just need to muscle through it harder. And that strategy probably worked in my 20s. It was a lot harder in my 30s when I had 2 kids and postpartum and all the craziness that comes with being a mom, a working mom. And as I got to my 40s and mid 40s, my body called in an intervention. Stop being crazy by trying to manage your crazy. Because guess what? Mental health is not a subjective issue. It is not a circumstantial issue. It is a clinical issue. It is an actual clinical diagnosis. So when I got diagnosed with my formal diagnosis of bipolar 2, somebody who's in healthcare, a very big advocate of wellness, integrated wellness, I fell into the deep, dark void of shame. I was actually very surprised how profoundly it overtook me because I was so embarrassed. I am bipolar 2. How am I supposed to show up in my life? How can I show up back in my workplace? Because now I'm going to be that unreliable, crazy leader. How would people accept me? I was even more petrified and embarrassingly so, sharing it. How could I show up in my life to my kids? Am I going to be a reliable parent? Or am I going to be that crazy mother to my spouse, to my friends? So that's when I realized how deep the roots of stigma of mental health ran within me, ran around me. It is an issue that is cultural. I come from a South Asian community, and much like many other communities, we don't talk about mental health. It is a taboo subject. It is shoved under the rug. It is not a weakness we want to own. It was something that was very much apparent in my work culture. Being in healthcare environment, we were a company that offered EAP program, that offered all the right things, but yet did we have this safe space for people to show up and say, this is a part of me. We are not embarrassed to admit if we have cancer. We wear that with a badge, proud badge. We're not embarrassed to say, I'm struggling with diabetes, hypertension. But dare we come out and say, I'm struggling with depression. I'm struggling with bipolar. I'm struggling with anxiety. Those are all become the sign of weakness. So I realized despite having the infrastructure, we had not invested in the safe culture to really create that space. And it ran in my community where it was a taboo subject. So what can cause stigma? I think lack of education, number one, that it is a clinical issue. It is not circumstantial, and lack of education, and through that, lack of challenging the perceptions, the negative connotations in the words we use to describe mental health. You're unreliable, you're crazy, especially for women. All of that compounds and leads to the stigma and prevents us from being open about it.
I love that answer. And you already touched on our next question, but someone asked for us the intro of the speakers and the panelists. And we were intentional and not in that because I love what you just said, our personal stories. I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in credentials, but when you're talking about mental health, it is hearing the personal story of women who are able to engage in this conversation, which is how we remove the stigma. And I think so far, a big part of this is going to be changing our language, language like crazy, right? Is it really crazy to feel your feelings, whatever they are, and not associate something good and or bad, but this is how I'm feeling in the moment, which is going to lead us to our next question. And Nancy, I want you to jump in here. And I think Shaylee talked about this. Does mental health differ culturally and generationally, and how so?
Yeah, thank you, Kia. And yes, I know Shelley's story, and absolutely.
Did Nancy freeze for everyone else? All right,
Folks, can you hear me okay?
we can hear you now.
Okay. So the answer is yes, it can differ culturally and generationally. Shelley just described her background and what it was like for her and her family and her community. Again, Shelley used the word, I believe you used the word shame, and that's what came up for me as I heard your story, that so many of us carry shame with mental health diagnoses or mental health issues. And for so many folks, having, showing up as not strong, not resilient, not being able to take everything on in the world is seen as weakness. And that's where that shame can come from. And depending upon the community that you grew up in, it can be stronger or perhaps less strong, depending upon, what your experience was. What I think is different now generationally, there has been this huge stigma. I've been a professional in this field for 30 years. I also came to this profession through family members and loved ones suffering tremendously with mental health and alcoholism. And because there were professionals who were there to support them, that gave me hope and a voice as a young woman, as a young teenager, to start to talk about mental health issues, and prompted me to then get into this field and decide to devote my life and my career to it. So I've had the opportunity to see mental health across the world from different cultures and different perspectives. And what's helpful now as we step into what's happening with this awful pandemic and the lives that we've all lived through the past year, we are seeing enough chaos that it's shifting, that people everywhere are beginning to recognize and speak up and realize that mental health is not only just a good to have or a nice to have benefit, but it's essential conversations to have in the workplace, in the community, in people's homes, and to support one another, especially as women, as we come together like this.
Nancy, I love that. Lynette, did you want to add in on this question?
Yeah, culturally and generationally, right? So I noticed in the comments after Shelly had shared how not only did she have to deal with the stigma within the workplace, even though she was working in a health industry, which that's a different conversation about how some of the organizations that are supposed to be the organizations supporting these different things are sometimes the worst at keeping their own policies in check. But I noticed in the comments that after Shelly had said what she said, you know, somebody said in the Latinx community, in the Black community as well. And there is definitely some things that are in common, and then there's some things that are not so much. You know, I can only speak to my own experience as a Black woman in America. You know, personally, I grew up in a very poor neighborhood, and you know, we didn't talk that much specifically about mental health issues. We didn't have the terminology. There was no education around it. And to top it off, you know, I don't know if you all saw the documentary on the Black church that just happened to come out on PBS, but we also, the Black community has had a very strong background with community being formed within religious community and life. And so if you're also a part of that community, and that community is saying things like, you just need to pray about it, you know, you need to trust Jesus a little bit more in that, you know, so we have, that's all a part of the Black culture experience. So we're holding those things. Now, what I would say the difference generationally is that this generation right now that are coming up, they're taking note of that, and they're saying enough is enough with this silence. And so we're seeing a lot of movement with, I would say, millennials coming up with these very specific sites, and maybe possibly even Gen Z doing things on TikTok. I just read an article about Gen Z really doing the TikTok thing to share about mental health with each other, to kind of go, let's normalize having this conversation. That's like a big phrase that I'm seeing on social media. Let's normalize this. And so now we're getting very culturally specific sites. We now have therapy for Black girls, therapy for Black kids. That's a new one. We have, somebody just said Jewish. So, you know, we have, you know, there's a Jewish Psychological Association. There's the Asian American Psychological Association. So we're getting these resources that are very specific to cultural differences, while also trying to unite, okay, what are the things that are in common? How can we come together to destigmatize these conversations, both culturally as possibly women, but also in a larger grand scheme of things. So I would say that, and I'm sitting on a borderline, I think I'm considered an ex-zennial. So, you know, I got to grow up in a generation before, I got to witness the generations before me where there was no conversation whatsoever. And, you know, as now an ex-zennial, you know, I'm starting to see more people in the generations before me that did not talk about it. And they're like, hey, I heard such and such went to therapy, and, you know, so we're beginning to talk about it. And as the older generations are affirming what's becoming normalized, the younger generations are being born into it. So it's not something that's new to them, kind of like technology. They're being born into technology. So now they're coming into a space where it's becoming normalized to talk about, yeah, you know, I'm suffering from depression, or hey, did you see the that new meme
Yeah.
about self-care. So we have a lot of things like that, really taking place. It makes me very hopeful with this younger generation.
I love that phrase you said, enough with the silence, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask Shelly to take this next question. So enough with the silence. So how do we create a safe space for professional women to share their feelings, their thoughts, and possibly fears in the workplace?
I would start by saying, before we jump into an action of creating a safe space, let's just examine what the word safe means for us individually and as an organization. Does a safe place individually mean for me where I can be okay bringing in my vulnerabilities, my imperfections, without the fear of being judged on that? That it's okay that I don't have it. I'm just going to say, I don't have my shit together today. I don't feel, on top of all things. I am doubting myself because that's what the lows look like. I'm fearful of, of judgment. And I would challenge, this is what I did when I took on the movement to, we need to talk, enough with the silence, we need to talk about it at my workplace. I challenge the leaders on, what does it truly mean? Do you just want to create a forum so you were checking off that box? Not only do I have an EAP program, I have forums where people can talk about it. Or are you going to lead by example? And you as a leader, are you going to show up there with your full vulnerabilities, with your imperfect self, and lead by example how you can own it? Because in the end, we're all looking for acceptance, self-acceptance, social acceptance. And from there, we tease on the courage and education to go then avail the resources we need to. So I would say we need to start by questioning and pondering on, what does safe space mean, and being intentional about it before we jump into the action of creating safe spaces in the workplace, because there would be cultural, generational, policy, all of those innuendos to it, specifics to it, that we need to then factor in, because a safe space for a South Asian, community person might look a little different than Latinx, might look a little different to a Caucasian one. On that, do we need to have a place where there is availability for language services and that? So those are the nuances that we need to spend some time understanding the peculiarities of our workplace before we jump into action and creating that safe space.
Oh, Shelly, I love that you started from defining a safe space for you. And I think as this event is being recorded and knowing the type of programming that Crew puts on, it's always leadership organizations and companies looking for a place to start. So I would love if people will put in the chat, how do you define a safe space? What better way than to hear from the people who obviously want to get this right? Maybe they're looking for something, who's on this event today. So please put in the chat. I believe there's question and answers, and you can put it in the question as anonymous if you don't want to use your name. But how do we define a safe space? And Nancy, I'm going to take that over to you and ask, what can we do? What can the people do in the workplace?
Thanks, Kia. Well, as I listened to Shelly, I was reminded, this is brand new, hot off the press, but last night I was listening to an interview that GW4W, Global Women for Wellbeing, did with a leader at PwC, a partner, female partner. And I was blown away. And it takes a lot for me to be blown away by the topic of mental health these days, because that's the space I live in all the time. What was so profound about it is she spoke so eloquently about her personal journey as a leader, and she had to make a decision. She thought that she had to leave work as a leader, she thought that she could no longer function, that she couldn't lead, and she came very close to ending her life. That was a choice because of her depression. But she also, in talking with a supportive manager, she was blown away by the support she got from her boss, who said, there are options here. How can we support you? Why don't you just take a few days off, a few weeks off, a few months off? Take some time away. Don't quit. Don't leave us. They saw enough value in her to care enough about her, to want to support her. And so when I think about leadership, and again, leaders are everywhere in the spectrum. There are leaders that may not be called leaders yet, but they are, and they carry knowledge and information that they can share. So I invite all of us to think about it that way. I'm going to share that link with you all. There's 2 links that I thought of that I want to share with you that our organization did recently, just podcast and Facebook recordings you can view about this topic. The other one has to do with an Asian American woman that we interviewed, and she started a group for Asian Americans to talk about mental health. So I want to be able to get that out before I forget. And so again, with that, what leaders can do is just open up the conversation. Lynn mentioned it so beautifully in the beginning. Yes, there's employee assistance programs and there are other benefits in companies. But what Shelley's getting at and what we're talking about in terms of this safe space is, how can someone like Liz Swigert, this woman I was just referring to, what was it that allowed her to talk about this? She started it off, in full vulnerability with her manager, thinking that she had to leave the workplace. But I think for each of us, it's defining who is that person that we trust. Usually there's at least one that deep down inside you can take a little bit more of a risk and reach out to. If that doesn't even exist for you, I would invite those of you that have access to counseling resources, to employee assistance programs, to check in with a professional and to just explore this conversation a little bit more for yourself and for creating some strategies around how do I engage and start this conversation and build upon the trust that I may already have and that we definitely need in order to have more conversations and break this stigma around mental health.
Nancy, I love what you said there. And Elaine in the chat, she said, not just leaders, but think about your coworkers and your clients as well as a possible avenue to express how you're feeling, right? And I'm going to share a very quick story. Right. And I started this thing by introducing myself as a long-term therapy goer, right? Long term. And as a business owner, as a woman, it's invaluable. I walked into a meeting with a possible new client and he goes, "Oh my God, I just felt your energy before you walked into the room." And my response to him, that's 18 solid months of good therapy. And he just laughed, right? So I think if we give people more grace to be understanding and showing them more vulnerability and authentic versions of ourselves, the repercussions are not what we think. Is that fair? Shelley, I see you shaking your head there. I see the high five. I love it. I love it. And also what I'm seeing in the chat is it's fear of repercussion, reprisal, which is a whole other conversation in itself. But if that is the greatest fear, one of the things I asked in our pre event call was, then is that the right organization for you to be at? Is that a safe space, a safe company? Is that fair?
Yeah, I'll just chime in. I couldn't agree more. We all have varying levels of what feels safe and what feels like the right amount of risk we can take. And I can't speak for someone who's choosing not to risk that because they may have some very valid reasons where if their greatest fear is that they'll lose their job, they might. So there are some places that exist where we don't have that kind of trust or support. But if you're at a place where you're willing to kind of face that fear. That's why I said, even talking about it with a friend or a colleague, to just measure it, to take it slowly and see, is this a place where I can be vulnerable enough to say something and not have something thrown back at me, not have somebody reprimand me or have that be used against me, just like anything else that we might bring to the workplace. So everyone has to evaluate that for themselves. We can't really make that decision for each other.
Absolutely. Lynette, go ahead. I see you want to chime in here.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what Shelley was originally saying, which was defining what a safe space is for you. Sometimes when we think about space, we're thinking about this large area, right? But a safe space can happen between you and I. We create that safe space together. So sometimes within a work environment itself, the safe space, and actually the way I look at it is it's this dual kind of relationship. You might be holding this safe space for me, but what I'm doing on my part, if I'm the one that's struggling with mental health issues, is that I need to have courageous space. I need to be able to have a space where I can be courageous enough to say, this is what's going on, and ask for help. And you create that safe space to hold for me. So even if we're in a hostile work environment, because we have a sick kid or we have elderly parents that we need to take care of, and right now is not the good time to leave that job, which is a very real possibility right now. Can I create courageous and safe space with somebody? And if it's not somebody within the work environment itself, then going back to what Nancy was saying, what are my resources so that I can work towards the possibility? Because sometimes when we're in our mental health, and I can say that from experience, I'm a mental health peer advocate, meaning I've been in mental health recovery for over 10 years. So can I create a space outside of this so that I can see windows of possibility, which is something I wouldn't be able to normally see if I'm stuck in my own depression or psychosis, or a mental health crisis, or even things that aren't necessarily mental health crises, but things that trigger it, such as this pandemic and being home all the time with kids that constantly go, what's for dinner? Which causes stress. So where can I create this space where I can be courageous enough to ask for help, even for the smallest things? Because sometimes we go, fine, I'll ask for these big things, but we don't want to talk about the small things as if they're too small. So creating these spaces of bravery, of courage, of safety doesn't even necessarily have to look like this big thing, but can it be something or a space where I can just get down and talk to you one-to-one and just have that support?
I love that. And this is a good question to what you're saying, Lynette. And I'm gonna ask Lynette and Shelley to chime in here. What is the best way to respond to someone who is being courageous and reaching out? But what if you're not able to put energy, time, and love into that interaction? How do you hurt without helping? How do you help them? How do you help them without hurting them?
I would say, and that happens. You're in the middle of doing life. You are maybe in your own little cray space, and there's somebody reaches out to you, and you can see it's a big effort for them to put themselves out there and reach you. But, I'm just not in that space where either, I can provide that space, attention, or I might not feel qualified. For example, Nancy, the example you were saying, if somebody comes and, they're thinking, I'm thinking about ending my life. Well, this person needs help, maybe a little more than what I could provide. That's just the distinction. And I would say, can we find in ourselves to just take a pause and acknowledge? The power of acknowledgement, the power of words to say, thank you for reaching out to me. I know it takes a lot to share that vulnerability, and it was a really big step and really brave of you. Even if you can take a pause to muster those 4 sentences, and I want to be there for you. However, would you allow me just an hour or 30 minutes for me either to go center myself so I could be wholly present for you, or would you allow me time that I can pull in the right resources that I think will be able to help you, but know that this is just a pause and you have my commitment that I'm going to reach out back to you, and genuinely mean that and follow up on that. It is not about solving it all. It is about being present and committing to that. So I would say, even if we can at minimum commit to that, that means the world. And I say that from my experience because I have been on the other side where that commitment and that presence and that acknowledgement meant the world to me at that my vulnerable moment.
Shelly, you know what you did there that I just adore? You said, I'm going to start with grace. You said, thank you for sharing that with me. If we started more dialogues with grace, and instead of saying, I'm sorry, I can't, but I'm going to ask for some grace, ooh, the conversations we could have. I love what you just said about acknowledgement. And I think we're all strive for acknowledgement in our own ways, and it looks so different for everyone else. That was beautifully said. Nancy, I saw you shaking your head. Did you want to chime in there? I know, Lynette, I might have saw you unmute yourself for a moment.
Oh, I just acknowledge, Shelley, you're so spot on. And what you just said, Kia, for catching the piece of grace about that, what I really encourage us to do is not apologize. So often women say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. There's nothing for us to apologize for. I couldn't agree more with Shelley. It's often just a few sentences, and it can be really taking a deep breath. Shelley, as you said, taking a pause, stepping back, checking in within myself, approaching this other person for this moment as a fellow human being on this walk of life. This walk of life that we have, we are two human beings trying to figure it out and get through life together. To be able to step back and say, wow, I hear you. That must have taken some courage. Thank you for confiding in me. And again, as Shelley said, if you don't feel that you have answers, you're not a mental health professional, it's not about solving any of this for that person. It's about acknowledging, I really hear you. Maybe it's, I hear your pain. I'm here for you. I need some time to step back and think about how I can best support you. Blah, 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 blah. That sort of thing. And if you are a person in your organization that does know about resources, offer those at some point to that person. And maybe that's part of the commitment. It isn't about solving, because if you're not a mental health professional, some people, as Shelley, as you said, there can be territory where that can be fearful for folks. And so there are, again, resources available to approach the situation. But most of the time I find having compassion, giving grace, taking a step back, being present with another person is the difference between them making a different choice very often.
Yeah, and I would chime into that because since I mentioned first mental health first aid, that's actually one of the first lessons that they teach. Is the biggest and one of the first things that you can give as a mental health first responder is this ability to just listen. A lot of times, especially with us women, we always try to solve something. We want to fix things and solve it so that we can keep pressing on and be strong women and things of that nature. And so being able to just have that moment where it's just like, you know what, I'm listening to you. And then I want to bring up something else because I've been in this circumstance quite a few times, and I've been on the other side as well. Actually, this recently happened in a different context, where sometimes you will encounter somebody and they might be family. That's when it actually kind of bothers you even more, because it's like, I really want to help this family member, and they won't do certain things. They're going to keep coming to me. And so I've had to deal with that a couple times. And often what I've had to do is a lot of the things that Shelly had mentioned, but I also had to recognize that because I am not their savior, I don't have to take on that guilt or any shame that I didn't do the best that I could to support them. And I think that's really important, especially if we start talking and walking into the realm of talking about suicide, because then you'll get that. You have, in my experience with a lot of suicide survivors, as in their family, they have a lot of survivor guilt. And it's like, what could I have done? Maybe I should have listened that day when I was tired and say, instead of saying this. And I just wanted to bring that up. Like, when you've done what you have done, such as what Shelly gave as an example, saying, I am acknowledging you, I'm listening to you, I'm going to take a moment to breathe, or I'm going to send you a resource. Or even me personally, I've actually, when I had that time, I was like, I will come to the 12-step recovery with you, brother. Like, I will go, I will go up in the 12-step with you if that's what you need me to do. Or, I will come to the therapy appointment. I'll be right in the waiting room. But there's times where we can't do that. We can't do that with everyone. We can't be in multiple places, and we can feel guilt about that. And so I wanted to also say that in addition to being on that side of trying to give grace, you need to give grace to yourself too.
So that's a perfect tee up. Then how do we start advocating for ourselves in the workplace? How do we start? Lynette?
Yeah.
Shelly.
I was just going to say what I did. I started to own my story. It all started by step one, me owning all of me owning these imperfect parts of me, what I perceived as imperfect. This is me. I am brilliant, I'm gregarious, I'm compassionate, and I struggle with mental health issues. That's all of me. Until there is self-acceptance, until we work on self-acceptance, because it's not a constant state of being, it's a journey always. Until we commit to that, no amount of external validation can really seep in and ground us for long. So I would start with working on self-acceptance, working on owning your story, all parts of you, even the ones that don't seem perfect some days, gives you the strength to show up, and also gives you the strength and opens you up to receive help, receive grace as well, because you have to be at a place and openness and receiving to fully embrace that. So that would be my one contribution.
Lynette, Nancy?
Yeah. I don't know. I think because I've been self-employed for so long, I create my rules. So at the same time, because of that, it's easy to break boundaries. And so I want to talk about, I would say that in doing so, you need to kind of create boundaries on what's going to take you further away from being healthy and well. And what does that look like? Sometimes we have to say no to things, and let our yes be our yes as well. Because if you have this full plate, then how will you have room for the things that you need to come if you're full on things that aren't very life-giving? And so I look at health that way. I look at mental health that way too. Mm-hmm. How full is my plate that I can't even make room to go to therapy or to go to my support group? How full is my plate that I can't even take time in the morning to do my journaling, because that's how I process. So I look at it through a practical lens. What are these practical things that I can do within my own life that can help contribute to these larger issues or larger ways of bringing a healthy balance into my life?
And Kia, I would just add, for those of you that are in a workplace setting, Again, back to what I said earlier, it begins with trust. Find those people in your organization that you trust. If you have an existing package of, let's say it's a wellness program that so many of you are familiar with, but they're missing the mental health component, or it's a benefits department that kind of pays lip service to mental health, but there's really no deeper support, or you have an employee assistance program, but you call up a hotline and you only get to talk to somebody for 20 minutes and that's it, that's really not good enough. And so it is about grabbing those folks that are like-minded enough and that you can trust and begin to have these conversations about what do we really want this workplace to be? How can it best support us? And as Lynn said, if you're working so many hours and you're exhausted, something's missing in terms of that work experience and how it's contributing not to your well-being, but to your demise. And so, but to have that conversation and to be vulnerable enough takes some trust and some courage, as Shelley and Lynn have both mentioned.
We got a lot to unpack there. I see a question in the chat. I think sometimes we often forget we have the power of choice. We get to choose if we are going to take the time to journal in the morning. And I think we are so busy going. We forget we have a choice. And Lynette, I love how you said learning how to say yes and no. And I think very simply saying no, enough is on my plate. Instead of saying I'm struggling with mental health, say I'm a human who is moving through my mental health journey. Everything doesn't have to be a struggle. It could be more of a choice. In the chat here, Laura said, I found particularly as women, it's not only important to be vocal of acknowledging one's strength during a moment of crisis, but to acknowledge strengths, talents in the more minor moments. I love that, because our next question is the one everyone's going to be asking, right? How are women coping during this pandemic? Everyone's going to ask, how did you cope during the pandemic? What did you do? But because we will get beyond the pandemic, what would you have said you've learned in this, what you've learned in this moment and how they coped during this time? What did you learn?
Who are you asking first? Shelley, do you want to go? Because you started.
Okay. I was just going to say, how did I cope? I'll just be very honest. Lots of wine hiding in my pantry away from the kids and my cat. Some evenings it was the wine that carried me through, but jokes aside, a lot of grace. I really had to learn to give myself grace. I have two boys working from home, two teenagers who are constantly hungry. No amount of food I can pick up from Costco or grocery store is ever enough. Virtual school, homeschooling, that was a big change for my boys, and they struggled with it too. And work and life was happening on top of it too. So I will admit I have type A tendencies. I want to fix everything. I want to do everything. I want to be there because I want to be a good mother and a good employer and a good person, a good daughter. And I had to learn to stop to strive to be good all the time and get real. And as easy it is to say, it's still a journey. I learned to prioritize self-care, which was, for me, when my dinner is done and kitchen is wrapped up, I put on my shoes and I go out for a walk in nature. That's essential to me. It is 15 minutes of meditation in the morning right before I jump out of bed and start my day. And again, it was a lot of grace when I know I should go for a walk, but instead I wanted to have a glass of wine and sit in front of Netflix. That's okay too. When I wanted to meditate, but really all in my meditation, I'm not even speaking English. I'm just counting all the things I'm just extremely mad about. Being grace about, on that too, that's okay. So what it taught me was to be gracious. And what it taught me was self-care and a commitment to that. It's truly just a journey. It's not a static place of being.
Nancy, how did you juggle your personal and professional life during this pandemic? How did you cope?
Well, I tell you, my biggest go-to is my moments of silence and nature. You saw me check in earlier, Kia, that I live in the Seattle area, and I have access. I am so fortunate that I have access to green space pretty much right outside my door. And it fills me up so much. When I moved out here 20 years ago, I discovered the mountains for the first time in my life. I grew up in the Midwest, and although I was in my backyard and I climbed trees and I did all kinds of things like that, I didn't know what I could get from the mountains. And it's my soul. It feeds my soul. That is what kept me sane, especially given that the work that I do is I hear from lots of people who are struggling. I will say, however, that through their struggles, I find strength. I've always been a person who has been interested in other people. So in hearing the stories of others, it brings me hope and resilience and inspiration, frankly. I will mention that when I read the report in December that 140,000 jobs in this country were lost to all women, get your head around that statistic, 140,000 jobs were lost, and every one of those jobs were held by a woman. I was crushed, knowing that these are often women who are at positions where they had to make a choice to care for their family or go to work. And so we have so much work to do to help lift each other up and carry each other through. And I'm so glad for the question, Kia, because that's one aspect of what has supported me, and Shelley has shared her story and Lynn will have hers, but we're all in this together, really. And having platforms like this in GW4W, we have a platform to have women tell their stories and support one another, has meant the world for many of us.
Yeah,
I want to ask that you share your story next.
yeah. So, I'm in this a special circumstance. So, I work full time. I run my business, but I'm also a full-time seminarian. And so my support system and coping mechanisms have intensified spiritually, where they had not in the past, mainly because I'm surrounded by people who are praying all the time. And so that's been the most surprising way that I've been coping, because I admit I was not really leaning on that. I have my background in mental health. I used to work in addictions, so for me to really lean on prayer life and finding solid ground in that has been actually really instrumental for my coping. So there's two sides. There's me going, school is driving me bananas and I need extra support. And so, I upped my therapy actually during this time, because I knew on the one side, I was struggling with the pandemic, and on the other, I was struggling with trying to keep up with my grad school work as well. And then on the other side, like something that Nancy mentioned, I realized that I'm the type of person that in order for me to cope and move through things, I also need to be surrounded by stories. Stories of hope, stories where people get to share, where I get to hold space. And so when this first broke, an organization that I was involved with for a pilgrimage said, we're going to start a whole nother project for crisis care for first responders. Does anybody want to help? I was one of the first ones to volunteer. I'm like, I don't know what I can do, but I want to help these first responders with the skills that I have. And honestly, helping first responders during the pandemic was probably one of the most helpful ways for me to cope, because I felt like I was contributing to helping the pandemic, like first responders were having all these different issues. So I got to help the first responders because I'm not a first responder, so I kind of need a two side. I kind of need my space to be held in, to be vulnerable. But I also am the type of person that I want to hold space. I want to hold areas or opportunities for people to be vulnerable, to create art if that's what's helpful for them, to do things that are practical that works for them. So that was really, really important to me. And in the process of listening to other people's stories, I also was able to find within myself that I was able to forgive myself for my anger, because I had a lot of that. And I didn't realize how angry I was about the pandemic, not because I couldn't see people, but like my own visceral reactions, because I'm also, a part-time caregiver to my grandma. So, people not doing certain things to protect their elder was like really, really making me mad. And I had to sit with that, because in my head, I'm like, I want to be this great and loving person. And and I had all this anger in me. And so I had to cope with this humanness of me, and like Shelly said, like accept all of that. Like I had to accept the humanness of the totality of emotions that I had. And that was really important to me, because in the process of feeling my own anger, I learned that there was another day for me, and that I was able to get through it because I was real with myself.
I love that. I'm gonna share how I cope, but I'm gonna also say we're wrapping up on our time. So if there are any questions, please ask them in the chat. But I don't think we realize how sometimes doing absolutely nothing and sitting in silence is exactly what our spirit needs. And we constantly try to replace things. So people say, well, what did you do in the pandemic? What skill did you learn? What hobby did you read? How many books did you do? And I said, I didn't try to replace anything, because maybe our plates were too full. So I tried to accept what was perceived as losses and just regain some silence and quiet time and do absolutely. I'm not streaming. I'm not listening to a podcast. I'm not drowning out my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions. And I'm a chatty Cathy. I'm just being quiet. And I think we should lean more into that silence as we press forward. Is that fair?
Beautiful.
Shanti says she feels so guilty. Guilt was a big part of this conversation today, this idea of guilt. I should be doing something. Stop shooting on yourselves. I say that all the time. I love that. Wow. Ladies, thank you for your time. This was an honest dialogue. I'm going to ask each of you to close us out with one final thought, knowing that this conversation has been recorded and will be shared. And Shelly, one final brief thought from you. Let's have it.
If we can all make that as part of our self-mantra or share with others who need it, you are gloriously whole. You are perfect in all your imperfections, because that is what makes us me. I will say the best thing that could happen to me was my mental health diagnosis. I could say that today, after 3 years, I did feel it, but it made me so much more fuller person, so much more aware and kinder and compassionate person. So it is not a setback. It is not a tragedy. It maybe is a growth opportunity on how you look at it. So be kind to yourself.
Lynette, close us out briefly. Then Nancy, it's on to you.
Yeah, I think really briefly, I would say that maybe sometimes we need to remind ourselves in alignment with mantras, an affirmation of, I'm doing the best that I can and it's enough.
Love
And
it.
that's it.
And for me, it's give yourself grace, give yourself love and compassion, and break the stigma. Use your voice. That's how we'll break the stigma around mental health.
Thank you all. Have a determined evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Be
So
well, be well.
yes. So for those of you that are still here, if you'd like to put any comments in the chat about how you would like to see us do a follow-up, just go ahead and do that. I'll leave the Zoom open for that purpose. And as you're all signing off, you can leave us your final thoughts and I'll be able to track that down. I had a request to send out the resource page again. I absolutely will. Sent that out in advance, but I'll send it out again to everybody who registered. Thanks again. Thanks, Lynette. Thanks, Lynn. It was so great to have you.